Stephen Miller leaned forward with that signature smirk, the kind that carried more arrogance than substance. His voice dripped with smug certainty as he delivered what he clearly thought was a knockout blow. A sharp gotcha line meant to corner Jasmine Crockett and expose her as unprepared. For a split second, the chamber froze. Gasps rippled across the audience, half in shock, half in anticipation of blood. This wasn't just a question. This was a strike designed to humiliate, but Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on Miller with a steadiness that made his smirk look suddenly flimsy. She didn't shuffle papers, didn't rush to answer. Instead, she let the silence hang, a silence that turned his performance into something fragile, almost desperate. The cameras zoomed in on Miller's smug grin, then cut to Crockett's calm resolve. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Arrogance versus composure, bluster versus steel. The chamber itself became a character in the drama. Every cough, every shuffle in the crowd echoed louder than it should have. Reporters glanced at each other, scribbling furiously, sensing that something bigger was brewing. Miller thought he had engineered his moment, the viral clip, the headline, the spectacle that would remind his base why they adored his ruthless swagger. Yet as the seconds ticked on, it became clear that his stage was about to be hijacked, because Crockett wasn't just anyone. She wasn't another target for Miller's well-rehearsed barbs. She carried with her a record, a voice, and a resilience forged in far harder battles than an ego-driven policy aide armed with a smirk. The stillness in her demeanor began to tilt the room's energy. People leaned forward. Phones started recording. Even those who had cheered Miller's jab moments earlier couldn't look away from the tension now shifting in Crockett's favor. This wasn't politics as usual. It was theater, it was trial, it was duel, and everyone sensed the balance was about to flip. Miller, basking in his own smugness, had no idea that the trap he thought he set for Crockett was in fact the stage for his own undoing. But Crockett's response wasn't just an answer. It was the beginning of Miller's unraveling. Asterisk Stephen. Miller wasn't some random figure tossing barbs from the sidelines. He was the architect of some of the most divisive and painful policies of the last decade. The travel bans. The family separation policy that tore children from their parents. Arms. The relentless stream of speeches and memos designed to pit real Americans against immigrants, Muslims, and anyone deemed other. When Miller spoke, he carried with him not just the weight of a smug comment, but the echoes of policies that scarred countless families. His words weren't just insults. They were symbols of a worldview that had inflicted real harm, and that's what made this moment bigger than a clash of personalities. When Miller smirked across the chamber, it wasn't just Miller versus Crockett. It was the voice of establishment cruelty squaring off against the persistence of communities who had survived it. For many watching, Miller represented the embodiment of power without empathy. Crockett, by contrast, stood as a reminder that dignity, truth, and lived experience still had a seat at the table. Even when others tried to silence them, the stakes weren't confined to that chamber. Millions of Americans, immigrant families, first-generation students, those who had felt the sting of exclusion, saw themselves in Crockett. They remembered the headlines Miller had written with his pen, the policies that had turned their lives into political battlegrounds. To watch him smirk now, to hear him attempt a smug takedown, wasn't just offensive. It was a reopening of wounds. But it was also an opportunity, the chance to see those wounds confronted, not with bitterness, but with strength. And Crockett knew it. She had long understood that her role wasn't just to debate policy, but to embody the resistance to the arrogance that men like Miller thrived on. Every time she raised her voice in hearings, every time she pressed for accountability, she was carrying more than her own reputation. She was carrying the weight of neighborhoods ignored, voices dismissed, and truths buried beneath rhetoric. That's why this confrontation mattered. It wasn't a spectacle for spectacle's sake. It was a test of narratives. Miller's polished cruelty versus Crockett's unshakable authenticity. Who would the country believe? The man who had shaped policies in the shadows of power, or the congresswoman who had fought in the daylight, case after case for those without a microphone? Or the chamber seemed to sense it too, what might have been brushed off as political theater. was suddenly electric with consequence. The smirk on Miller's face wasn't just arrogance, it was a dare. Could Crockett rise above? Could she turn his weapon into his downfall? Or would his reputation as a ruthless debater overwhelm the moment? For progressives, for immigrants, for those who had endured the fallout of his policies, the answer mattered. More than entertainment, it was validation, justice, perhaps even redemption. Because in that room, Miller wasn't just testing Crockett, he was testing the strength of truth against the machinery of cruelty. Had helped build, and Crockett wasn't about to let his smirk write the story. Stephen Miller had built his reputation on being the man behind the curtain, the architect of sharp-edged policies, and the master of political wordplay. For years, his face was less familiar than his fingerprints etched into executive orders, talking points, and speeches that carried the unmistakable mark of his ideology. He was young compared to many of the Washington power brokers, but what he lacked in age, he made up for in ruthlessness. His name became synonymous with strategy that didn't just win headlines, but cut deep into the lives of ordinary people. He prided himself on precision. To Miller, words weren't just tools, they were weapons. On television panels and policy briefings and private debates, he sharpened his rhetoric until it was designed to slice opponents down before they could even finish a sentence. He thrived on smug dismissals, the smirk that implied, "I've already won before you've begun." Countless adversaries had stumbled under the weight of his word games. Trapped in the technicalities and half-truths, he spun with an air of intellectual superiority. But beneath the polished delivery and clever turns of phrase, there was a darker pattern. He cloaked himself in patriotism, speaking of security, sovereignty, and the supposed defense of American values. Yet the policies he championed, from immigration bans that targeted entire faiths, to the separation of children from their parents at the border, revealed something else entirely. His version of patriotism demanded exclusion, division, and pain. Families fractured, dreams deferred, communities branded as threats. And still, Miller wore the smirk, claiming it was all in service of protecting the nation. For years, this contradiction fueled his power. He projected himself as the ultimate strategist, the man who outsmarted not only Democrats, but sometimes even his own party. He cast himself as a guardian of America while drafting policies that told millions of Americans they didn't belong. And he rarely flinched, rarely broke character. Opponents who faced him in debates often found themselves tangled in his rhetorical traps, where one misstep became fodder for his smirk and his smug follow-up line. That smirk was his trademark. It wasn't just confidence, it was performance. To Miller, every confrontation was a duel of appearances as much as arguments. He didn't need to win hearts, only to dominate minds with the appearance of superiority. If his opponent faltered, even for a second, he had already claimed victory, but with that confidence came arrogance, the kind that insulated him from reckoning with the human cost of his work. He could dismiss critics as naive, dismiss pain as necessary, dismiss morality as weakness. For Miller, politics was chess, and the pawns were faceless. His allies praised his genius. His enemies decried his cruelty. Yet both agreed Miller was formidable. He knew how to win battles by controlling the language, by shifting the frame, by forcing others to fight on his terms. Still, arrogance has its blind spots, and one of Miller's was his belief that everyone could be rattled by his tactics. Smug smirk was built on the assumption that truth, dignity, and lived experience would always buckle beneath sharp rhetoric. It worked on panels, it worked in press conferences, it worked in debates against those who came armed with statistics, but not with stories. Miller could unravel data with a quip, dismantle statistics with a sneer, but what Miller underestimated was the power of authenticity. His world was built on control of language, of optics, of framing, yet authenticity operates outside that control. Lived truth doesn't bend to smirks or word games. And that's where the cracks in his armor began to show. Because while Miller could parry with career politicians or seasoned pundits, Jasmine Crockett was different. She didn't speak from abstractions or from theories polished in think tanks. She spoke from scars, courtroom battles where families' futures were on the line, neighborhoods where policies weren't just headlines but heartbreaks. Her words weren't sharpened in echo chambers but forged in fire. And fire doesn't yield to smugness. For all of Miller's reputation as a razor-sharp strategist, the duel with Crockett would reveal a truth he had long ignored. Word games can only hold power until they meet a force that refuses to play. He had spent his career reducing opponents to silence, forcing them to stumble over his rhetorical traps. But this time, silence wouldn't be hers. But word games crumble when truth cuts through, and Crockett knew how to cut. Jasmine Crockett didn't come into politics polished by privilege or groomed by elite institutions. Her story began in the very places where policy wasn't a matter of theory, but of survival. She was the daughter of a community that knew what it meant to fight for dignity day by day. A child who grew up hearing the voices of those America too often pushed to the margins. That memory never left her. It became the foundation of everything she built: her law career, her public service, and the steady resolve that defined her. When she entered law school, she wasn't chasing prestige. She was chasing power, not for herself, but for the people who never had it. She saw the law as a weapon, one that could be bent to oppress or wielded to liberate. For Crockett, there was no middle ground. Every textbook case was more than a lesson. It was a mirror reflecting the battles waiting outside the classroom. She knew where she would stand when those battles came, and they came quickly. As a young attorney, Crockett didn't aim for the cushy firms or the corner offices. She chose the trenches: public defense, civil rights, and the cases no one else wanted. She stood beside people who had been told their voices didn't matter. Immigrants fighting deportation. Young black men facing sentences that far outweighed their crimes. Families crushed under the weight of systemic neglect. Courtrooms became her battlegrounds, and she fought with grit sharpened by necessity. Judges raised eyebrows, opposing counsel sneered, institutions leaned on their weight. Yet time and again, Crockett turned those stacked odds into victories. Not every case was a win on paper, but each one was a victory of presence, proof that no matter how rigged the system felt, her clients were not alone. She carried their pain, their resilience, into every word she spoke. What set her apart wasn't just her knowledge of the law, though she was sharp, unflinching, and prepared. It was her refusal to separate law from life. When she cross-examined, she wasn't just dismantling arguments, she was protecting someone's future. When she presented evidence, she wasn't reciting facts. She was channeling the voices of those silenced outside the courtroom. Every objection, every ruling, every closing statement carried the weight of more than one story. That kind of practice carved a different kind of lawyer, one unshaken by intimidation, one immune to elitist arrogance. I had already faced worse than smirks. She had walked into rooms where the presumption of guilt hung heavy over her client's shoulders, where her own identity as a black woman lawyer was doubted before she even spoke. And still, she won respect the only way respect. That matters can be won through fire, persistence, and results. Her community knew it. They saw her as more than a lawyer. She was a defender, a translator of the law into dignity. Mothers whispered her name in gratitude after their sons came home free. Families embraced her after verdicts that gave them another chance. Activists marched with more confidence, knowing she was ready to take their causes to court. Crockett didn't just represent individuals. She represented the collective voice of the silenced, the ignored, the written off. And when she stepped into politics, that voice only grew louder. She carried the courtroom rhythm into congressional hearings, blending precision with passion. Her questions cut through the fog of evasion. Her speeches rang not with rehearsed talking points, but with lived conviction. The same grit that once faced down skeptical judges now faced down stonewalling witnesses and arrogant officials. Every time she spoke, it wasn't just her own fire, it was the fire of the people she had stood beside. The immigrant father, terrified of being deported. The teenager facing a stacked system. The grandmother fighting for housing rights. Their voices carried in hers, and that authenticity made her immune to the kind of intellectual traps that men like Stephen Miller thrived on. Because for Crockett, The fight was never about abstract theories of law or polished debates. It was about human beings, their lives, their futures, their dignity. That's what she brought to every confrontation. And that's why Miller's smirk, sharp as it was, didn't shake her. She had stared down power before, and power had blinked first. Her rise was not accidental, was forged by necessity, tempered by injustice, and strengthened by victories that were never given, always earned. Crockett wasn't a creation of the establishment, she was its challenger. And in that, she embodied something Miller could never touch, authenticity born from lived struggle. So when Miller leaned forward with his smirk, armed with years of rehearsed dismissals and word games, Crockett didn't flinch. She carried every case, every client, every courtroom scar into that moment. And scars do more than remind, they steel. And that fire was about to meet Miller's smirk head-on. The chamber buzzed with tension. Every eye fixed on the table where Stephen Miller leaned back in his chair, smirk curling as if he had already declared victory. He spoke with that slow, deliberate cadence designed to belittle, stretching each word so it dripped with superiority. "Congresswoman," he drawled, "you sound passionate. But passion is not policy. Passion doesn't secure borders. Passion doesn't protect America." Gasps rippled, but Crockett didn't flinch. She met his gaze with steady calm, the kind honed in courtrooms where sneers were routine. Her reply was measured, deliberate. "Mr. Miller, passion doesn't separate children from their parents. Policies you wrote did. And America is still reckoning with the cruelty you called security." The audience stirred. Conservatives in the crowd clapped, eager for Miller's counter. Progressives leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting for Crockett's next strike. Miller didn't wait long, cut in before she could finish her sentence, waving his hand as if brushing her away. "Here we go. Another lecture. Always the victim narrative, always the dramatics. The law requires firmness, Congresswoman, not feelings." The sneer was sharp. The interruption louder this time, but Crockett's face remained unshaken. She leaned slightly closer to the mic. "Firmness is not cruelty, Mr. Miller, and feelings. They belong to the families you ripped apart, the children who cried for parents they may never see again. That's not dramatics. That's reality," the crowd rumbled. Some clapped, some jeered. Miller leaned forward now, sharpening his attack. "Reality is that without borders, we don't have a country. You'd rather grandstand for applause than make hard decisions. That's why people like me get things done, while people like you make speeches." This time, it was Crockett who let the silence linger before speaking. She tilted her head, calm but fierce. "Hard decisions? Is it hard, Mr. Miller, to look a child in the eyes while they're torn from their parents? Was it hard to defend cages as policy? Or was it just easy for someone who never had to face the consequences of his cruelty?" The chamber broke in two. Noise, some applauding, others hissing. Miller's smirk deepened, but the flash in his eyes betrayed irritation. He leaned in closer, voice rising, trying to cut her down with speed. "You see, this is why your arguments collapse. Can't defend open borders. You can't defend chaos. All you can do is moralize, and moralizing doesn't make policy. It makes weakness, and weakness doesn't protect America." Crockett let him finish this time. She didn't rush, didn't interrupt, didn't match his volume. Instead, she drew strength from the growing hush as the room waited for her answer. "Weakness, Mr. Miller," she said slowly, "is hiding cruelty behind the word policy. Weakness is twisting words until they no longer resemble truth. Strength is standing up when it's easier to stay silent. Strength is knowing. That power means protecting people, not destroying them." The chamber swayed with reactions, conservatives cheering Miller's bravado, progressives roaring for Crockett's composure and fire. Back and forth it went, word against word, sneer against precision. Each time Miller interrupted, Crockett steadied herself. Each time he twisted her words, she untangled them with facts and heart. The duel wasn't just legal, it was moral. Miller grew louder, more animated, the smirk bending into a snarl as his words poured faster, trying to dominate the air. Crockett, by contrast, grew sharper with each response, her tone like a blade that only cut deeper the calmer it became. The audience could feel the scales shifting. It wasn't just sparring anymore. It was a storm. Miller's arrogance was rising like thunder, but Crockett's answers were lightning. Striking with precision, lighting up the dark corners of his rhetoric. And then, as if sensing his moment had come, Miller leaned forward with a grin that signaled his winning line. He delivered it like a dagger, sharp and smug, his voice rising to punctuate the blow. Then came Miller's winning line, the one Crockett would flip into his downfall. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze. Miller's winning line still hung in the air, his grin stretching wider as if he had just carved Crockett out. Of the debate entirely, he leaned back, arms folded, basking in his own cleverness, certain that his dagger had landed. The conservatives in the room cheered, a few even whistling. He looked like a man who believed the duel was already over. Crockett didn't move. She let the noise swell and fade. Her stillness was deliberate, a silence heavy enough to draw every eye back to her. The smirk on Miller's face flickered as her calm became its own counterpunch. Then, slowly, she leaned toward the microphone. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice firm but steady. "You seem to think this is about clever lines. But families didn't lose each other in clever lines. Children didn't cry themselves to sleep because of punchlines. They cried because of the policies you designed." The air shifted. The chamber, once noisy, suddenly holding its breath. Crockett reached into her binder. Not a stack of notes for theater, but a record of lives. "You talk about strength? Let's talk about strength. Strength is Maria Hernandez, who stood in a courtroom alone after her husband was deported under one of your orders, and still raised 3 children while working 2 jobs. Strength is the father who testified through tears that his son died in detention because he couldn't get medical care. That's the reality your policies created. That's not weakness. That's survival." Gasps cut through the silence. Even some who had cheered Miller shifted uncomfortably. Miller tried to interject, but Crockett lifted her hand slightly. Not a shout, not a command, just a gesture that carried the weight of authority. And she pressed forward. "You brag about protecting America, but the America you claim to protect is smaller than the real one. The America I know includes the immigrant mother who became a nurse and saved lives during COVID. It includes the refugee child who grew up to wear this nation's uniform in the military. It includes the farm workers who put food on tables, even when this country tried to push them out. These are the people you call weakness, but their strength built this nation." The crowd erupted in applause from one side, while the other side fumed, their cheers drowned out. Miller leaned forward, his smirk tightening, jaw clenching. Crockett didn't stop. She began listing the facts methodically, as if in court. "Since 2018, federal judges, your peers, ruled multiple times that your family separation policies violated constitutional rights. They called them cruel, inhumane, and un-American. These aren't my words. These are the court's words. The very system you claim to defend found your work illegal." Now the gasps were louder, sharper. Miller blinked, his expression betraying the first crack. "And let's not forget," Crockett continued, her tone sharp, "as steel, that your so-called travel ban was gutted and narrowed by the Supreme Court after challenges you tried to dismiss. You lost, Mr. Miller, not because of weakness, but because this country still has a heartbeat stronger than your cruelty." Her words hung like a hammer striking steel. The room fell into that rare silence where truth feels undeniable. Then came the applause, not scattered, not timid, but a wave that rose from one corner and spread like fire. Gasps, cheers, even a few shouts of, "That's right." Miller shifted in his seat, his smirk finally gone. He opened his mouth to reply, but the roar of the room swallowed him whole. His clever line, the dagger he thought had landed, was now a boomerang lodged in his own armor. Crockett leaned back, letting the applause swell. She hadn't needed to shout. She hadn't needed theatrics. Her weapon had been precision. Facts sharpened by compassion, delivered with a clarity that exposed Miller's arrogance as empty bluster. And yet she wasn't done. She leaned into the mic once more, lowering her tone so the audience hushed to hear. "You asked about strength? Let me tell you mine. My strength is standing here, unflinching, while you try to reduce people to numbers and slogans. My strength is knowing that I don't answer to you, Mr. Miller. I answer to the people who live with the consequences of your policies. And to them, I owe the truth." That final line cut deeper than any statistic. Miller blinked hard, looking down at his notes as if they might rescue him. But there was no rescue. He was exposed, a strategist, outmaneuvered by the very authenticity he had tried to dismiss. Phones were already up. Clips were recording. In the back, aides tapped furiously at screens, knowing this moment was about to explode online. Hashtags wrote themselves. Hashtag Crockett destroys Miller. Hashtag strength is truth. Hashtag mic drop moment. The moderator tried to regain order, but the chamber had tilted. The duel had ended, and everyone knew who had won. Miller sat rigid, his face pale under the harsh lights, the smirk erased. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her silence now was louder than any insult he had thrown. And in that silence, America witnessed something rare. Arrogance faltering before truth, cruelty trembling before compassion. A strategist. Undone by a congresswoman's unshakable strength, the audience would replay it again and again. The gasps, the facts, the applause. But for those in the room, one realization was undeniable. The moment Miller thought would define his dominance had instead become the proof of his defeat. But the shockwaves didn't end in that room. They spread across America. The chamber still hummed with the echo of Crockett's words. But outside those walls, the eruption had already begun. Within minutes, phones buzzed across the country. Twitter lit up first, the clips spreading like wildfire. A single caption caught fire. She wiped that smirk clean off his face. The hashtag followed. Hashtag smirk wiped. It climbed to trending within the hour, carried by progressives, comedians, and even celebrities who had no direct ties to politics, but couldn't resist amplifying the moment. Soon came the avalanche. Hashtag Miller owned. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag strengthist. The internet baptized the exchange as not just a debate, but a cultural showdown. Arrogance versus authenticity, cruelty versus compassion, on TikTok. Creators looped Miller's smug grin right before Crockett's counterstrike, syncing it to soundtracks of cinematic drum beats, record scratches, and mic drops. One edit zoomed in on Miller's face as his smirk collapsed, overlaid with the words, "When word games meet receipts." Another stitched Crockett's words with footage of immigrant families embracing, protest chants, and American flags waving, transforming her rebuttal into something larger than a clapback, into a rallying cry. YouTube Shorts spun into overdrive. Reaction channels dissected the moment frame by frame, pausing on Crockett's unwavering gaze and Miller's faltering posture. One host declared that was the look of a man who realized, that he had finally met someone he couldn't talk circles around. The clip racked up millions of views in hours. By nightfall, the late-night hosts had their monologues ready. One opened with, "Stephen Miller tried to smirk his way through a debate, and Jasmine Crockett hit him so hard with facts that his smirk filed for asylum." The audience roared with laughter. The moment sealed as pop cultural shorthand for arrogance undone. But it wasn't just comedy. Analysts across networks framed it with gravitas. One commentator said, "This wasn't a debate exchange. It was a referendum." Miller represents the cold calculation of policy stripped of humanity. Crockett represents the lived reality of those policies, and tonight, reality spoke louder. Another called it a cultural pivot point, the day smug. Elitism cracked against grassroots truth. Even international outlets took notice. Headlines blazed from London to Snow, Paulo. U.S. debate sparks viral firestorm. Smirk wiped in Washington showdown.
European commentators
tied it to the broader struggle between rising far-right rhetoric and those who resist with lived experience. In Latin America, Crockett's name trended alongside the word dignidad, dignity, and in the U.S. Polls and think pieces flooded in. Younger voters especially seized on the exchange, reposting Crockett's lines as affirmations, mantras, and proof that politics didn't have to be hollow. College students wore t-shirts with "strength is survival" printed in bold across the chest. Memes became movements, and movements became conversation starters in classrooms, churches, and family kitchens. Meanwhile, Miller's defenders scrambled. Some tried to spin his smirk as confidence under fire. Others doubled down, claiming Crockett's takedown was emotional theatrics. But the clips didn't lie. The visual was too stark. The smug strategist crumbling, the congresswoman commanding. Every denial only seemed to amplify the reality viewers had witnessed. And in the silence after the laughter and hashtags, something deeper stirred. People weren't just laughing at a smirk being wiped. They were reflecting. Immigrant families who had lived through Miller's policies posted emotional comments for the first time. I felt like someone spoke for us on that stage. Young activists shared the clip alongside their own stories of resilience, declaring this is why we fight. The moment had gone beyond spectacle. It had become symbol. A duel that began with one man's arrogance ended with a nation questioning who really speaks for its future. Yet beyond the memes and applause, deeper reckoning was stirring. Asterisk when the storm of applause ebbed and the hashtags had begun there. Relentless climb. Crockett leaned back into the microphone. Her voice wasn't raised now. It was steady, resonant, and deliberate. She knew the moment wasn't just about dismantling Miller's smirk or savoring a win. It was about something bigger, about what America chooses to honor in its leaders. "Me be clear," she began, scanning the room, her gaze heavy with conviction. This was never about humiliating anyone. It's about accountability. It's about what happens when arrogance is allowed to masquerade as leadership. When cruelty dresses itself as patriotism, and when truth is dismissed as weakness. The chamber stilled. Miller, who had once leaned so comfortably on his condescension, now sat rigid, his silence louder than any retort. Crockett continued, words now echoing as if crafted for every living room, every phone screen, every kitchen, table where families were watching. Arrogance builds walls. Truth tears them down. Arrogance points fingers. Truth extends hands. Arrogance tries to define who belongs. Truth reminds us we all do. The line landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward. Those who had cheered Miller moments earlier couldn't deny the power in her clarity. This wasn't theater anymore. It was testimony. She reminded the audience that her voice was never just her own. When I speak, I carry with me the voices of those who've been told they don't matter. The children who cried at the border. The parents separated by policy papers written by men who will never know their names. The workers dismissed. The citizens forgotten. The immigrants silenced. Their truth is my truth, and no smirk can erase. This wasn't the rhetoric of a politician sparring for points. It was the raw, polished core of lived experience, sharpened by years of courtroom grit and community battles. Crockett reframed the entire exchange, not as a personal victory over Miller, but as proof that truth, when spoken without fear, has the power to break through even the thickest armor of cynicism. Miller's hollow cleverness had been exposed. For what it was, word games without weight, walls without foundations. Crockett's clarity, by contrast, was undeniable, grounded not in ideology but in humanity. Commentators would later call this her defining moment, the point where she elevated beyond the clash itself into something aspirational. Wasn't just countering Miller. She was holding a mirror up to the nation, asking it to choose what it values most: smug calculation or fearless authenticity. Her closing words carried that weight. Debate isn't just about who can twist words the sharpest. It's about who speaks with the strength of truth. History won't remember the smirk. It will remember the voices that rose above it. And in living rooms and feeds across America, people nodded, some with tears, some with clenched fists, others with quiet resolve. Crockett had turned a viral clapback into a moral reckoning, into a reminder that arrogance fades. But dignity endures, and for millions watching, the question lingered: Whose voice do we trust with America's future? Asterisk Stephen Miller walked into that chamber with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. He left it with his smirk erased, his words turned to dust by a truth too sharp to dodge. The title said it all. He tried to outsmart Jasmine. Crockett, but her clarity, her courage, her lived truth left him exposed and regretful. If you felt that surge of justice when Crockett flipped the script, you weren't alone. Millions across the country felt it too, a reminder that arrogance may dominate the headlines, but authenticity dominates the heart. This wasn't just another political sparring match. It was a cultural reckoning, a collision between smug dismissal and fearless accountability. And here's the real takeaway. What Crockett showed us isn't just about Miller. It's about every time someone tries to silence you, dismiss you, reduce you to less than you are. It's about remembering that truth, when spoken with conviction, is always louder than insult. If you're with us in that fight for dignity over arrogance, make sure you're part of this movement. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story with friends and family. Add your voice to the chorus, demanding leaders who value people over power, truth over games, justice over cruelty. Because this moment wasn't about one hearing or one exchange. It was about something larger, about whose voices we choose to lift and whose we refuse to let define us. Stephen Miller may have walked in with a smirk, but Jasmine Crockett walked out with something far stronger, the trust of millions who now know where the real power lies. And the question for America is simple: whose voice will you believe?